Hey there. Today I wanted to pick up on the issue of timing spells again, not quite continuing from where I left off, but instead discussing a concept that I touched on but didn't delve into in any detail: the distinction between one-off workings and extended craft, and in particular, what I think separates the two in terms of when I think one is in fact preferable to the other, and a couple of reasons for why that is. Before starting, though, I want to make clear that I am not claiming special expertise, nor secret knowledge of hard and fast facts of witchcraft, if there even is such a thing. Instead, all I can offer you here are opinions based on experience and theory, which include private extrapolations from research on learning and cognition. Ultimately, neither I nor anybody else can state with absolute certainty that there is a right way to go about defining what makes a good one-off spell, or what spacing works for multi-episode extended spellcraft, and no doubt my opinions on these scores will continue to evolve, but for what it's worth, I think some of them have provided really great payoffs that justify sharing them here. As always, you'll have to sort out for yourself whether you agree. So for those who've watched or listened to a bunch of my videos, it will have probably become apparent that I put a decent amount of stock in the concept of novelty. That is, the new, the untried in my practice. And I don't mean in the nobody's ever done this before sense, but in the sense that I've never done this sort of spell this way, I've never used this herb, never applied this technique, never explored this turf. In reality, I probably rely just as much on repetition in my work, but without diving too far down this particular fork in the conversational road, suffice it to say that one of the ways novelty manifests in my practice is a strong tendency to prefer one-off spells over workings that involve multiple episodes of ritual all focused on the same goal. For me, one-off spells are rendered more thrilling by their unfamiliarity, more intense by their restricted time frame. I sit at my altar, or wherever else, cast my circle, pour my guts into whatever it is I'm doing until I hit that magical O, and by the time I come back down, I can consider it a job well done, light my metaphorical cigarette, and come dawn, move on to other things. The one-off spell provides an immediate sense of completion, catharsis, and the sense of unburdened progress in one pretty little ceremonial package. Whether my one-off spells are simple or complexly layered, whether they're kitchen witchery inspired and completed within the span of 5 minutes, or rituals penned with care that demand weeks of prep, I have come to think that their perceived success depends upon one particularly crucial point regarding the nature of the goal I have in mind. And simply put, that point is, if the goal of a spell depends upon the long-term alteration of ingrained patterns of behavior, then a one-off spell is unlikely to be as effective as multi-episode extended craft. At the risk of dredging up memories of your excruciatingly dull 5th grade English class, I think the best way to make my own thinking clear on this score is to parse this sentence a bit. But don't worry, it won't take more than a couple minutes. I won't touch on grammar either. First off, when I say, if the goal depends upon altering patterns of behavior, I don't mean that these behavioral changes must explicitly be the purpose of the spell. They can be, of course. Trying to break your addiction to high fructose corn syrup would be a goal that is itself expressly the breaking of a behavioral tendency. But becoming the most valued employee in your shop isn't, although it too probably depends upon behavioral change. If, however, the goal is long-term but does not depend on behavioral change, I'm typically just as well served by a one-off spell as multi-episode extended. Also note that I said one-off spells aren't the way to go specifically when the behavioral tweak required is long-term. If you're hoping to rock your finals next week, You're going to want to ramp up your drive to study, your capacity to internalize and remember information, the clarity of your thoughts perhaps, the willpower to decline invitations to party, but really only briefly. You may tend towards slacking off, and one of your long-term aspirations may be to change that. But for now, what you're really looking for is a quick boost in motivation, and possibly a few other things, to see you through the immediate future. So a one-off spell can do really nicely and is in fact ideally suited to providing that kind of quick burst of something. Conversely, if it's the beginning of your last year in undergrad and you're hoping to get into grad school, you may want better study habits to become a fixture in your life. And if that's the case, a one-off spell is less likely to cut it, and it's probably time to consider a more involved multi-episode working. Why do I feel this way? Why am I separating spells into these two categories in particular? And why am I suggesting that a spell's inclusion in one group or the other determines the method by which it's executed? Why does any of this matter? Well, the answer to all of those questions is because sometimes we fail. And the risks and repercussions of those failures, the toll they take, are quite different in these two sets of cases. From what I've seen, the idea that potent spellcraft depends on an absence of doubt is about as close as witches get to a consensus opinion. Depending upon who you're talking to, the concept may be framed as, you need to need it, or once a spell's done, don't even think about it, or silence, witchling, for if you speak of spells that haven't yet materialized, they never will. And each of these recommendations is, of course, multifaceted, but from the standpoint of doubt specifically, it seems to me that they aren't really different ideas so much as different strategies to achieving the same thing: the repression of doubt. Needing it, rather than merely wanting it, serves this goal by reducing the risk that one will ruminate over whether they should have acted to begin with. Not talking about a spell reduces doubt by tackling a couple of challenges, and one of those is essentially the same one achieved by not thinking about the spell, which is in turn the caster's equivalent of a rather popular coping strategy with a long and proud history: avoidance. Now, like many coping strategies, avoidance works perfectly well in the right situation and over the right time frame, provided one appreciates that it's a temporary fix, best employed to delay rather than permanently derail having to deal with something. As a long-term solution, though, it blows, in part because it gets progressively harder to pull off as time goes by, and the stress of maintaining a mental version of la la la, I don't hear you, la 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 la, often ends up worsening things rather than improving them. These same tendencies hold true in our own example too, where the something being avoided is doubt over the ultimate efficacy of one's craft. Thus, one can readily engage in avoidance during one-off spells designed to elicit rapid outcomes with immediate onset, or spells without a specific goal in mind, or spells whose payoff is anticipated to be delayed, but whose memory won't constantly be re-evoked, while one's self-control is repeatedly tested by, for instance, repeated attempts to engage in behaviors that serve to draw thoughts of the spell to the forefront of one's mind. But making the strategy work over months and in the face of constant reminders and constant risk of falling short of what one may or may not achieve, well, that isn't so easy. In fact, I'd go so far as to say it's practically impossible. And the don't think about it approach to doubt avoidance in these cases, therefore destined to fail. Your mileage may vary, but I do not typically enjoy greater success at spellcraft when I make it a point of including new and exciting opportunities to disappoint myself. Therefore, when I know going into a spell that avoidance isn't going to work, I accept it and modify my craft instead so that my work takes this into account. And I include direct means of tackling the inevitable toll that instances of failure induce. One of the great beauties of one-and-done spells, the way I do them, is that in a worst-case scenario, I still can only fail the once. I may bomb at a fundraising engagement I tried to make myself awesome at. I may lose the apartment I'm already mentally redecorating to a higher bidder, but because the nature of the goals, which relate to singular events or items, are one and done themselves, that failure doesn't follow me around. It doesn't grow in the back of my mind while I wait for the next time my spellcasting efficacy is tested. Even though I'll no doubt have to speak to donors again, and still need to find an apartment because I crafted my spells around that particular speech and that particular flat, subsequent similar engagements remain distinct in my mind and untainted. Pessimism thereby gains no foothold in my future. As counterintuitive as it may seem, I think that a failed one-off spell is less likely to undermine future efforts at spellcraft than is being successful at a goal you try to reach every day but only achieve 70% of the time. Now, for those of you keeping track, that means I've just said that a 100% failure rate is preferable to a 30% one, which sounds utterly inane, but bear with me. The reason I think this is because for all that our brains are essentially just very complex statistical computing machines, they are flawed ones and biased. And objective outcome often matters less than perception. The thing about that 100% failure rate is that because we only have one instance, one example by which to gauge our failed spell, we do not know and will never know what the actual odds of succeeding were. Never know how close we came to pulling it off. For all we imagine, if we repeated the same effort 100 times, we could have gotten what we wanted 99 of those times. A single event tells us, and our brains, nothing about the true probability of an event. A single failure can therefore very easily be chalked up to a fluke, and our brains, busily keeping track of the odds of every little thing we do, will reserve judgment on that one instance for lack of data, and grant us the freedom to remain generally optimistic about our chances in the future. If I were to use a single one-off spell to alter an ingrained pattern of behavior, let's pick a goal. The goal here is to reduce the social anxiety that materializes as a tendency to put our foot in our mouth to our utter embarrassment. If I were to use a one-off spell whose aim is to reduce that tendency, then here is the simple reality of the situation. I will inevitably put my foot in my mouth and get embarrassed. In other words, I will fail at some point. And because the embarrassment and foot chomping is cyclical, when I do fail, there's a decent chance that I won't be at my social best for a while thereafter, which in turn ramps up the odds of me feeling embarrassed yet again, putting my foot in my mouth in the near future, and so on. Let's say then that the probability of me being able to socialize without embarrassment after my spell is actually 0.7. or 70%. That is, overall, every 2 out of 3 times I have a lovely time socializing and walk away from the experience delighted and with all family honor intact. Objectively, this is the probability of success. But my brain doesn't see it that way because it makes an assumption about probabilities that does not hold true in reality. It assumes that when the odds of success are 2 out of 3, this is what a string of social interactions will look like. Success, success, failure. Success, success, failure. Success, failure, success. success, success, failure. It expects my experiences, even over a small number of instances, to both add up nicely to 70% or 2 out of 3 in the very short term, barring external influences, and for the failures to be evenly distributed amongst the successes. In other words, it expects my experiences to be obviously and clearly representative of the overall probability of success. Unfortunately, even when an event is truly random, which behavior obviously isn't, this expectation of representativeness often doesn't hold true. In our example of cyclical embarrassment, here's what we are at least as likely to experience. Success, success, success. Awesome! Starting strong. Success, success, success. Woohoo! We rock! Success, success, failure. Okay, that's fine. Back on the horse. Failure. Damn it. Failure. Oh God, what the hell? Failure. And this is the point where we give up and consign ourselves to a lifetime of spell-crafting impotence and social rejection. In this example, I kept the absolute ratio of success to 2 out of 3. Which means that mathematically, the absolute odds of success were identical to the ones presented before. But our brains do not see or interpret these two scenarios the same way. Rather, this second scenario violates the expectation of representativeness in 2 ways. Instances of success and failure do not add up to 70% over the short term, nor are failures evenly distributed. And so what your brain actually concludes is that we had achieved a 100% success rate, and then something changed. Some new variable interceded, some crucial ingredient was lost, and our success rate plummeted as a result to 0. Worse yet, since behavior isn't random, not only is it more likely that successes and failures will cluster, but after a certain number of failures, the odds of success will take a dive. Because not only our spellcasting, but the goal of that work itself depends heavily on finding and maintaining confidence, on perceived capability. And so it is 0% successes as far as the fates can see now. Because unlike the one-off spell that failed, your brain has enough data to draw a conclusion, and its conclusion is that you lost whatever knack you once had for the task at hand and are now complete shit at it. Uplifting, isn't it? Well, here's the thing. It's actually quite fortunate that our brains prioritize recent trends over the total absolute probability of events, because in the real world, things do change. External variables do intercede and alter how the future is likely to unfold. It just happens to be rather inconvenient when we're trying to form new habits or break old ones. That is, it's inconvenient when we try to do this without admitting to ourselves that this is indeed how our brains tend to operate. Provided we don't shove our heads in the sand, though, we can actually turn this tendency to our very great advantage. Which is why, when working a spell to make or break patterns of behavior, interrupting the patterns of successes and failures at intervals, and in so doing, giving yourself specific variables that the brain can credit with those achievements or use to mitigate any failings, can significantly improve both your experience and the real-world odds of victory. Sorting out when the best time to do that is, and how to interrupt or even avoid downward spirals before they have a chance to bugger up your flow, is also a long topic, and so one I'll get to in the next video. As is always the case, though, I'll happily clear up any bits of this that weren't clear, so don't hesitate to post a question in the comments section if you've got one. Until next time then, happy spellcasting and a lovely weekend to you all.